Hey everybody, and welcome back to my Arabian Free Fly coaster experiment. Now, as you might notice, I've been doing some off-camera stuff, and I have to say this is something that's going to be a recurring theme throughout this series. Normally, I don't like to do too many things off-camera. I actually prefer to figure out what it is exactly that I've been doing that actually stays in the park, and try to record all of that and edit that together. So, for example, there will be times when I'm building something and it ends up not being used or scrapped for something else. I think it's reasonable to cut that kind of footage, but when important stuff gets done, I usually try to show it off. But in this case, I think it's probably good to try a different approach, because especially with the first section of the coaster layout here, I've been experimenting so much, and in general this entire build is going to take a lot of off-camera just rotating around, figuring out what kind of sightlines I want to build and things like that. And I think there's just certain types of things that you tend to do, or at least that I tend to do in the game, that aren't very conducive to recording time lapses and making it look decent. Because I'm trying to move the camera around as little as possible whenever I'm recording these time lapses, which works fairly well for when you're trying to build buildings or come up with a dome structure like I'm doing right now, but it doesn't work very well for when you're trying to figure out the layout of a park or messing with ideas before you're actually building something, which is something that I really do like to do, because one of the worst things that you can ever have is building a building and putting all of the details in and working everything out, and then realizing that it's too big for the space, or it just doesn't work out, or you don't see it from certain parts of the park that you do want to see it from. So working out composition and sight lines and stuff like that will still be something that I'm gonna keep doing off camera. Another thing is the start of the layouts of the coaster here. I was trying to come up with ideas on what to do with the dark ride section. That's going to be the start of the ride, and that just took a lot of trial and error. Now, I know there's this whole meme about YouTubers doing things off camera. I swear I'm not going to do huge monumental things and suddenly show you a castle that wasn't there before, but stuff like that will happen in the future. So, and by stuff like that, I mean smaller things and mostly moving stuff around. Anyway, let's talk for a second about what I'm building here, because I wanted to build as much of a symmetrical layout to these buildings as possible, given the fact that this part of the coaster layout is also symmetrical, but at the same time I wanted the tower at the front to really be the centerpiece of this whole cluster of buildings and towers, and to be the small local weenie of this area. So for this tower I'm going for a similar size, but a slightly different shape. It's completely round, and it has a dome, I guess, yeah, on top of it, but it's not a very fancy dome, and it's not a very tall dome. And something that I realized in hindsight, but wasn't really the intent of this tower, but it works out perfectly, is that this dome actually might help transition this themed area into the next themed land. Because as you might know, I am trying to make the transitions between themed areas as smooth as possible in this map, and make certain areas where you're not pulled out of the immersion by a sudden different theme appearing out of nowhere. And part of the solution to that is going to be trying different variations of a theme within an area and using those to blend from one part of an area to another. And this is going to have some kind of real-world geography connotations as well. So to give you an example, this dome that I just built, I figured that it might actually fit into that area because it's a little bit reminiscent of Ottoman domes, which, unlike Persian domes or, say, Mughal architecture from India, they don't tend to feature those onion shapes, but instead they're just regular semicircles. And Ottoman domes used to also be made with terracotta tiles, and later on more lead tiles and stuff like that. It's just that the material use and the shape reminds me a bit of an Ottoman dome rather than the Persian theming which this area is supposed to have. And I think that's probably a good thing, because around that part of the park I'm going to build an Ottoman themed land at some point to transition to another future themed land. And by the way, if this all sounds really strange and like I'm planning a park and not just this ride and this area here, that's because I'm trying to build this ride in such a way that it could seamlessly transition into a park if I ever get to finish it and go far enough with this that it's going to turn into a proper park. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I made with Fantasy Valley, aka the park that I built the B&M flying coaster Suzaku in, is that from the outset I made it into a park and it never really ended up being finished, even though I was happy with the area that I did finish with Suzaku in it. But to this day, people are still asking me when I'm going to reboot Fantasy Valley. And at this point, I'm thinking it might actually be a better approach to just build certain rides and make a themed land around it and make them fit into each other in such a way that I could make a park out of it at some point in the future. And trust me, I am laying down the foundations and the composition of this park already as we speak, but I'm not going to promise anytime soon that I will actually finish this, because the more I work on this themed land on its own, the more I start to realize that I want to make building this into a park an option, but not a necessity. So for now, I'm going to stick with this area, but do keep in mind that I'm planning to connect this to a whole big park. And in that park, there's going to be an Ottoman section to transition from the Arabian themed land into the European themed land, because if I think there's any kind of architecture that can kind of fit into both of these categories, it's Ottoman architecture, because they do have those minarets and the domes that you see a lot of it in Arabian architecture. They had a huge influence over the Middle East in general, but also you can find a lot of Ottoman-inspired architecture in Europe, especially Greece and the Balkans. And I think from there you can really transition into a European-themed land without having a drastic change where everything suddenly switches and you go through a gate and suddenly you're in a very different land, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I would really love to try in this park to make those transitions as seamless as possible. And I think from a geography standpoint, it would be really cool as well, because at that point you're traveling from Persia towards Europe and you're going through a small Ottoman-themed section and then ending up in Greece or Albania or something like that. And it's like having a microcosm of traveling from the Middle East to Europe in the theme park in terms of the themes that you're going to be walking through. And I feel like that would be really cool. There are so many theme parks in the world that already try to emulate the themes of different countries, but not really put them on a sort of geographical composition where it could make real life sense. It's like you're making a small journey through the world on a miniature version of it at least. So that's kind of what I'm planning here, and that's why I was pretty happy with that domed building in hindsight, because I'm gonna put some Ottoman-themed buildings right across the road from it, so that's probably gonna help transition into that part. So this next section of time-lapse is pretty important for me. I think this was the section where I realized that this was a theme that was gonna be doable, that I could do on a large scale, and that I could theme this entire coaster. Because truth be told, until now I was building these towers around the coaster, but I had no idea how to theme the rest of this area, how it would be laid out and how it would even work. So I was still unsure if this was really going to be continued, if this was going to be something decent. But at this point I started building some facades as a show building cover. Because we do have a dark ride section here at the start, just a few turns, it's nothing major, it's kind of like the Flying Dutchman, except even shorter than that, but I really like the idea of starting off the coaster experience with a small dark ride section, especially on this coaster because, well, the theme and the story are where I put the emphasis, so I think it makes more sense than going straight into the lift hill. But because of that, this ride kind of sits in the middle of the park, and it is sort of toward the edge, but there's a lot of show building that I'm gonna have to cover, which is not the most handy thing. Typically, as a very heavily themed theme park, if you look, for instance, on Google Maps at Disney or Universal parks, you'll see that they have smaller buildings that are the themed buildings that you think you're going into, and then hidden behind those smaller buildings they have huge buildings where they house the actual dark rides and roller coasters. I think Phantom Manor in Disneyland Paris does an amazing job at this. I think all of the haunted mansions from Disney in general do a really good job at this, at making you feel like you're just going into a small building and then using the interior of that building, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, but there are some really cool tricks there to disorient people and make them not realize that they're actually going into a very big show building that they hid at the back with some trees in front of it or scenery in front of it or something like that. So that's usually what you would do as a theme park to hide your giant dark ride buildings, but in this case, I think it's actually a decent idea to have this thing right here kind of in the middle of the park, because it gives me an excuse to build lots of sort of simple but theme setting buildings here. So there are going to be a few facades here in this Arabian Persian style that I was trying to mess around with, and it's kind of the proof of concept for this whole theme, because I really want to make it feel like you're in a big city with lots of buildings around you and some minarets, some wind catchers, and a huge mosque perhaps somewhere. So this is all part of that. So these buildings are not going to be buildings that you can enter, they're purely cosmetic, which I guess is a little bit lame. Preferably you do want to have some plinths of buildings that you can actually open and that people can use as restaurants or restrooms or something like that. But in this case, I need so many buildings in this area to convincingly give that city vibe. And I'm only gonna have 2 coasters, some bathrooms at some point, a restaurant and a souvenir shop. At least that's my planning so far. So there's only gonna be so many buildings that are actually gonna have a function. So I'm definitely gonna have to place some buildings that don't have a function, at least not from street level, that people can enter. So using this dark ride section to add lots of just huge building space into this area and trying to make it seem as much as possible like there are all kinds of different smaller building facades, I think is a decent solution at achieving that city look. And to come back to the whole rant that I started this part of the video with, that's kind of how this felt like a proof of concept for me, because I wasn't really sure if this big wall of Arabian-inspired buildings was really going to work out. But in the end, I think it does pretty well, and I'm pretty happy with it. And it was also, compared to the other buildings so far, a really good test of the Theme Maker's Toolkit items, especially the decals. And I think they make a huge difference in terms of how these buildings look. They really come out and make this stucco look more interesting and textured. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with this so far. Now at this point, I kept the in-game paths as sort of a placeholder until I figured out what I wanted to do with this area. And at some point I realized what might be fun to try is to do one of those big concrete tile things. There are lots of theme parks that have big concrete tiles that are colored and slightly discolored at this point in time. And that was a look that I really wanted to try and figure out how it could work in Planet Coaster. So these big stucco pieces that I'm using for this are not super textured, but by putting a bunch of them together and giving them all slightly different colors and rotating them around a bit, I think you can make an interesting enough texture, and that's what I ended up doing over here. So this is going to be my path style for this whole Arabian part of the park. As per usual, usually if you look at Disney parks, Universal parks, or any heavily themed theme parks in general, usually you'll have different colors and textures of paths per area. So that's one of the easiest ways to tell where you are. So as for me, I'm going to stick with this color and texture for the Arabian part, and then trying to see where I can switch to other path styles in different parts of the park. But this is going to be it here. The only thing that kind of irks me about it in hindsight is these pieces, for some reason, their LODs disappear very quickly when you zoom out. So I ended up raising these paths quite a bit, which looks alright if there aren't any people walking around. But when there are people walking around, you can definitely see the soles of their feet kind of sinking into the path covers. And I know in Planet Coaster that's kind of a given, that's something that you usually have to deal with, but in this case it's a little bit more noticeable, so not entirely sure how much of a fan I am of this look. I will turn all of these paths into a single building at some point in the future, because I forgot to do that at this point. And well, once it's one building, I can always try to raise and lower it according to what I think looks decent, and I won't have to put too much time into that. But still, it's a little bit iffy. But moving on from the path discussion, here's an interesting tidbit where I'm trying to build a Persian-inspired fountain. Originally, I was thinking of doing Persian gardens somewhere, which are very geometrically shaped gardens, typically with large plazas or buildings or palaces around them or on one side of them. But in the end, I don't think that type of garden works out very well for a theme park. So maybe I can do some Persian-inspired gardening somewhere. And for now, I'm going to stick with this fountain, which is something that you'll often find in Persian gardens. They'll have these long stretches of fountains throughout the middle or the sides or wherever throughout these geometric gardens. And this particular shape, I actually don't know what it's called, but it's a very particular shape of this style of architecture, is something that I figured if I'm gonna have a fountain somewhere in the area, it has to be this one. And it's kind of a shame we don't have it in the game, because it is a pretty common shape for fountains in general. So I figured I would build my own. The only challenge with this turned out to be that there's no way to fill this thing with water. Obviously the middle is actually made out of another fountain piece, so that has its proper water texture and all. But the actual lower part of the fountain, there's no way to actually fill this thing. So I kind of forgot about that when I was building this thing, and truth be told, I was pretty excited for how well it was working out. All of these different textured and themed pieces actually work pretty well together, and you can make some pretty fancy classical looking stuff with them. But yeah, that water is definitely going to be a challenge. So there you see me cutting from doing some off-screen footage. I was looking at that fountain and trying to come up with ideas for what to do with it for way too long, until I eventually decided to just put some bushes in there, which I think it works alright, although it wasn't my idea, because recently, as you know, I was in Disneyland Paris, and at the Ratatouille section, they also have a fountain with flowers and bushes in it instead of water, and I think it looks pretty cool. So it wasn't really my original idea to do with this fountain, but now that I'm looking at it and you see all this greenery, I think it's a really nice touch, especially given the fact that all of the buildings around this area are all very beige and brown. Same goes for the path texture, which it's a lot of brown, shades of brown. It's something that I ended up going with anyway, because I think it conveys that sense of desert quite well, even when the rest of this park is quite temperate and there's a lot of foliage. So I'm still pretty happy with it, but it's a lot of brown. It's not so many nice lush colors. So adding this green in there was worked out pretty well. I think in the end it looks better than water would have looked anyway. So, and moving on from that, I'm going to finish this whole row of buildings here with some more facades, which is pretty fun because at this point I really kind of have my my workflow completed for these, and that is just to make a rectangular part of the facade with stucco walls, give it a slightly different color than the other ones so you get some color variation in the buildings, add a door, add some windows, preferably also some oriel windows here and there. It's something that you'll find a lot in Middle Eastern architecture, be it Egyptian or Persian or whatever, is these windows that jut out are made out of wood and hang over the streets. Sometimes you'll even have entire floors of buildings hang over the streets. So that's definitely something that I'm going to add to a lot of the buildings in this area. And finally, I'm going to build another wind catcher here, which was always the plan for this corner. There's just something about corners and adding what we call in Dutch a hoogte accent. And I don't know what a good English word for it would be, but typically on the corners of a row of building facades, it's nice to add something taller and something for the eye to look at and see as the focal point of that whole area. And I think this wind catcher does a pretty good job at doing that without being too over the top. I think once you start adding domes on corner buildings, you're going kind of off from the actual way that this theme should be done, I think. Adding too many domes, like I said in the first episode, I think is one of the biggest pitfalls that you can have when you're doing an Arabian-themed area. Not that there's anything wrong with it. If you're into it and it looks cool, I'd guess why the hell not? But in this case, I'm trying to be a little bit more realistic than that and trying to conserve my dome usage for when it actually counts. So yeah, staying within the theme of the buildings that I already have, I'm trying to come up with ways to make some slightly custom windows and doors as well, to not make everything look too much the same. And there are lots of wooden pieces in the game that work really well for it. Even in-game pieces, there's no use for using ThemeMaker toolkit items for things like this, I think. And also, something that I didn't touch on in the first episode, but I think is fun to point out as well, I'm just adding some bricks into the stucco layers here and there to give the idea of these being brick buildings that were stuccoed over, or you can see some of the structures peeking through the surface layer of these buildings. And the same goes for some of the decal pieces as well, which work really well to give that sort of weathered, slightly dilapidated look. Finally, it was time for me to do some finishing touches around the area, and first thing that kind of irked me and that I wanted to fix was the exit out from the show building. And gosh, this coaster type is kind of annoying when it comes to things like this, because these trains are so wide, it's really hard to just make a small hole in this building and make it look decent and, you know, be a regular exit. No, instead of that, you have these multiple meter wide vehicles, and even worse, there's two of them, so I have to make these huge holes in this building to even let those things go out. So to kind of hide these holes, I built that smaller building right on the plaza that I was just putting all of these facades in, to try and make these giant holes as invisible as possible from street level, because it's going to be a bit weird if you can look into the whole dark ride section of the coaster. But yeah, that's a challenge that I am willing to deal with. It's part of what I signed up to, building these types of coasters. But it's definitely something to keep in mind. And at some point in the future, you know, these coasters are going to have to re-enter a building when they come back into the station. And I'm definitely going to have to think about how I'm going to dress that up in some way where you can slowly get used to the dark as well when you're riding these coasters, and to not make the entry back into the building look too weird. It's definitely gonna require some special attention, I think, as opposed to just making some holes in buildings. Now finally, and this was the most boring part of this whole video, I think, it's definitely the part that I was procrastinating on, and there's a good reason it's the last part of this time-lapse. I had to do the backside of these buildings, and while there's not going to be going too much attention to this area, I really wanted to have some finished backsides as well. So just putting in some final details, a few buildings here and there, and some foliage. And at some point in the future, but this is going to be in many episodes, because as we speak I have no plans to tackle this anytime soon, but at some point in the future there's going to be a small path winding down this side of the building and going right underneath the red coasters layouts. Speaking of which, I haven't come up with how I'm going to divide the names of these coasters, but one of them is gonna be the Caliph and one of them is gonna be the Vizier, but I'll decide which is which at some point in the future. But for now, there's gonna be a path going down underneath the red one. So I'm trying to make this area somewhat future-proof, but we'll come back to this later. For now, it's not going to be too interesting. Alright, now before I end this video, I want to give a quick real-time overview of what I have so far. There's actually a few things that I didn't showcase yet, but this is the start of the station, or however this is going to work, but this is definitely subject to change in some of the future episodes. Do know for now though that when I get to the station, it's going to be a bit of a logistical challenge because we need to get people in from both sides of both tracks. So that is 4 entrances, and we of course need to get the people out as well. And the reason for this is that of course we have 2 dueling coasters that you can only enter from one side of the track. So there's going to be a lot of stuff involved with that. Then there's this part of the building which is reserved for a dark ride portion. And as you can see, these facades over here are trying their hardest to hide the fact that this is really a show building. But in a sense, it also gives me the opportunity to add lots of facades and really establish a city-like character to this whole area without having to worry too much about what kind of restaurants or rides or anything like this is going to fit in here. And then we have the entrance, of course, which I will detail a little bit more in the future. As you can see right now, it doesn't really have a ceiling. But as you can tell, if you're on the path over here, this little building here kind of hides where the lift hills have to come out of. And then the lift hills themselves also give a sort of scenic overview to everybody who is down here and vice versa as well. I imagine that from the lift hill, you'll have a pretty cool view of the track that you're about to ride over here. Some of the towers around you, a palm tree over here that has a hitbox that is smaller than the palm tree itself. So it disappears sometimes. But yeah, this is basically the tower structure at this point. So as you can see, we have all of these beams going into these towers at the same angles, which supposedly is to hide the fact that there's really a large metal beam in the middle of the tower, which is supporting all of this weight. But then, of course, these also kind of have a thematic function as well. I hope you don't hear the kids screaming outside, in which case, I'm sorry. It definitely sounds like something horrible is going down out there, but I'm sure they're doing fine. Anyway, so as you can see here, there's a bit of a strange support over here, trying to support this catwalk portion, which is also themed a little bit. Not exactly sure to what, but at least it's something fun to interact with. And over here as well, it gives some really interesting head choppers and food choppers, I guess, as well. But I think that's enough talking about these rides themselves. I think you guys have been killing for me to finally ride these things and give a small POV. I saw some comments in the previous video where people were asking for some POVs, and I have to say, for now, I can't give you guys a full POV because I haven't even finished the whole layout yet. I have no idea what I'm gonna do over here. But for now, I think a POV of one side of everything that I have so far is probably fair. So this is all going to be future dark ride stuff. Definitely gonna clean that up at some point in the future. And here we have the lift hill. As you can see, it's not even a very big coaster. I believe this lift hill is only a little over 12 or 15 or so meters tall. It's not very large. And then over here, as we pass the tower here, we start flipping to the other side. There's a pretty heavy swing over here as we flip back and go through this mid-course brake run. And then over here, the 2 trains will come together at the same time and they'll be synchronized as they go over this little... I'm not even sure what to call it, but the combined lie-to-fly element that you have over here. I just noticed that I think there's something wrong with the synchronization of these trains. Oh well, that will be fixed in the future, so don't worry about that. But you'll get to see them actually duel in glory. If all goes right, then these first sections, of course, will be symmetrical, so they'll be just as fast, so they'll be dueling up until this point. Then, of course, purple gets the inner curve over here, so it manages to get some headway, and then it's the higher point on this light-to-fly element, so then red will make up some speed, and they'll be hopefully going down this drop right at the same time, as I'm trying to get a good perspective of it, and then into whatever comes after this. Also, good thing to keep in mind is that for the station I'm planning a pretty big monumental building, and over here we'll have a bridge going over the coaster tracks and up to the station. So that'll be a cool sightline and also some fun path interaction. So they'll be crossing over the paths over here into another brake run and then down below the paths, and then this area around here can be themed with some buildings and foliage to really complete the city square area over here. So yeah, that is basically all of my plans for this coaster. I will slightly raise these path textures because, as you can see when you zoom out, they're glitching a little bit, but I'll fix that in the future as well. And for now, that's gonna be it. Hopefully I'll see you guys in the next episode where I'll be working on the station area, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.